So welcome everyone to another edition of the Way Too Long Author Forum. I am proud to have my friend Jemar Tisby, Dr. Jemar Tisby, who is professor of history at Simmons College of Kentucky. I've got that right. And brand new book that just landed on my porch. You can see it in the background back there, but here's the hard copy, The Spirit of Justice,
Nice.
True Stories of Faith, Race, and Resistance. Brand
Did
new
you
off
get
the
you
press.
get the fancy influencer
I did.
kit?
You got all fancy
Yeah,
packaging and stuff. I
that
even
was
had
cool
like
packaging.
the
It
cover
was
on the
it was
outside.
bubble wrap. Yeah, it was like a bubble envelope, but it was like the cover of the book was the pattern on the bubble wrap.
Yeah,
So we thought that was pretty cool. Wasn't
it was
my idea,
great. Like, and
obviously.
all kinds of inserts with postcards and stickers and yeah, all kinds of swag coming with it. Well, look, before we jump in, let me kind of just welcome everybody again and remind everybody of the structure. So we will typically go, Jemar and I will talk 25, 30 minutes or so, and then we will open it up for questions from everyone there. Let me invite those of you who hasn't done this before. What we typically do is in the chat, if you want to just drop your first name and where you're from. It's always interesting to see kind of where people are hailing from today. And then the Q&A section, if you will start dropping questions in, again, we'll turn to those about 25, 30 minutes in, and we'll kind of then have that part of the conversation second. But I'm going to jump in. So Jemar and I have been friends now for, I don't know, years. And I was kind of looking back, and I had almost forgotten, Jemar, that like one of our first earliest connections was the New York Times asked you to give the review of White Too Long back in 2020, when it came out. So, and that was before you and I were like, I think, had hung out a lot or really talked a lot. So before we put ourselves together, the New York Times kind of put us together. But we've hung out in Helena, Arkansas, and the Delta,
Yes.
and are now embarking on a little joint project called the Convocation. If those of you don't know it, Jemar and I are teaming up with Kristin Du Mez and Diana Butler Bass on a kind of joint Substack project, but it's also become a YouTube channel, an audio podcast coming soon that we kind of only soft launch, but if you search it, you can find it's called the Convocation Unscripted. It's out there. So anyway, Jemar, I've been rambling on, but welcome to the conversation today, and thanks
I
so
want to
much. Yeah, for this
Yes,
great book.
thank you. Thank you for having me on. I want to talk about the book, but I got to go back and remark about a couple of things you said. Number one, that New York Times book review has been a source of perennial trolling for me.
Oh, is that
And I
right?
love it. I love
Great.
it. Yes,
You're welcome.
because well, I was just following the data in your book, White Too Long, and I said in the final paragraph, and by the way, the biggest challenge of writing this book review is it's only like 500 words or something. It's very short. But in the last paragraph, I wrote this: white Christians have to face the possibility that everything they've learned about how to practice their faith has been designed to explicitly or implicitly reinforce a racist structure. In the end, White Too Long seems to present a stark choice: hold on to white Christianity or hold on to Jesus. It cannot be both. First of all, I like that paragraph.
Yeah, you
Secondly,
wrote about Jesus in the New York Times.
I snuck it in there. And so right-wing Christians have constantly gone back to that book review and posted it up to see Jemar Tisby and Robbie Jones are racist. They're anti-white, all of this stuff. And then secondly, anybody who comes and visits me in the Delta is automatically in a higher category of friend. So
All right.
the fact that we were able to link up there is very, very special.
Yeah, we did that while I was doing some research, on Tallahatchie County, right, which is right across
Yep.
the river. So we were able to hang out, and you were living in the area at the time. All right, well, let's jump into the book. I always try to start with, this is not your first rodeo as an author. If you look over your shoulder there, we see evidence of that on your shelf behind you. You're also a New York Times bestselling author of The Color of Compromise as well. and another book in between there, How to Fight Racism. So tell me a little bit about the journey and like what brought you, from those books. You're also a historian, right? Teaching full time to this book. Like, why this book?
So I was actually thinking about this book as I wrote The Color of Compromise, because that's the story essentially of white Christians behaving badly when it comes to race. And I was always like, but there's another side to the story. And what about black Christians, right? And it's really interesting. Like, a lot of people have asked me in various ways, have you ever been tempted to lose the faith or walk away from Christianity because of all the racism, not just in the
Mm.
past, but that you've seen in the present? And I was like, no, no, that didn't make any sense to me, because I always knew there was another way of following Jesus, that demonstrated in particular by the Black Christian tradition, not to mention the global church and the historic church, right, for 1400 years before uh, the social construct of race came to be. So I always had it in mind, and the three books fit together: Color of Compromise, How to Fight Racism, and Spirit of Justice. Color of Compromise: what's wrong? What's the problem? How to fight racism? What do we do about the problem? Spirit of Justice: okay, this problem is really hard. How do we maintain motivation and inspiration in the midst of the struggle? So I think you can read all three. You can read them in any order, but they do coherently go together quite beside my planning.
Great. Yeah. And say a little bit more. I know, like, in the trailer, and I've heard you talk about it, that, we're in a moment, some people talked about a kind of moment of racial reckoning, right, in the country, where these difficult histories are surfacing. Your work has been important in doing that work. I've tried to lend a hand in, doing that work. But along with doing that work, particularly year after year, it can be taxing, right? And you talk about, like, even in the book trailer, about kind of what do you do, like exhaustion and feeling like, oh, it's not a straight line, right? You take two steps
Mm-hmm,
forward, there's maybe
mm-hmm,
three steps back sometimes.
mm-hmm.
And what does this book tell us about those kind of moments and how to keep going?
Well, the book opens with a story about Myrlie Evers Williams that I was an eyewitness to. She was at the grand opening of the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum in Jackson, Mississippi, December 9th,
My hometown.
2017. Yeah, yeah, exactly. It was a fraught time in a lot of ways that I get into in the book, but she gives her public address and then afterwards does a small press conference that I was present at. And a journalist asked her, well, how does now, in terms of racial justice and civil rights, compare to then during the civil rights movement when her husband, Medgar Evers, was murdered? And she said, I'm seeing things now that I hoped I'd never see again.
Mm.
And she said, it looks a lot like then, right now. And she said that she was weary at that point. And I think as an 84-year-old woman, she has the right to be weary. And that was back in 2017. She's still alive today. And then she said something I'll never forget. She said, but it's something about the spirit of justice. And she makes this analogy to a war horse, being put out to pasture and then hearing that the bell of freedom again and then getting ready for battle. And she says, you become determined all over again. And that really captures the spirit of the book, The Spirit of Justice. That somehow, this person in her ninth decade of life, who had spent her whole life fighting racism, was ready to be determined all over again. And I said, why? How is that? And how is that in every age of history? You can look at that. And I said, that's the spirit of justice. That's the through line.
Yeah, well, it's such a beautiful story. I should say that, if I'm looking at who's here today, we got a few of my fellow Mississippians here who probably
All
been
right.
to
All
been to the
right.
museum, and may even have connections.
William in Oxford. I went to the
Yeah,
University of Mississippi.
there we go. Some raised hands.
Yeah.
Right on. Well, say a little bit more about the spirit of justice and kind of, it's a thread that you pull through the book, as you give, you pick it up from Myrlie Evers Williams' talk there, but you kind of develop it and pick it up through the book. And maybe just develop that a little bit more. What does it mean, and why do you kind of keep coming back to that?
So I think I would explain it like to kids, because I used to be a sixth grade teacher, and I'm always kind of thinking, how would I say this to a group of sixth graders? Um, I think you can describe the spirit of justice as the "that's not right" spirit. So kids have this really interesting sense of fairness. They can detect immediately, almost to a fault, when something isn't fair or something isn't right or something isn't just. And they'll say, "Well, that's not right." Meaning that's not fair, that's not righteous, right? And that's what the spirit of justice is in all of us. As a Christian, I think that's the fingerprint of God on us as image bearers of God, um, who have dignity and worth just by being human. And so when we are dehumanized, when we are treated unjustly, the spirit of justice is that sense within us that says, I deserve better. I deserve more. Um, and what is remarkable to me is not evil. Evil is unsurprising. Injustice is unsurprising. What's remarkable to me is that there are always people willing to stand up against injustice. And that is the strength from that, I think, comes from the spirit of justice, the "that's not right" spirit.
That's great. Well, I didn't actually count, Jamar, but I don't know. There must be 80 stories in here. Do you
Yeah,
know how many there are?
it's it's over 50 different
Okay.
individuals, organizations, events in there. It was, so that was a challenge in writing this book, to get into the sort of weeds a little bit. Is I wasn't doing a biography where I could focus on one person and just do a deep dive into that person's story, nor was I focusing on one person a chapter, which other books do. So you can get a little bit more in depth. I was doing several people in every chapter. Why? Because I wanted to demonstrate that the spirit of justice isn't cropping up in isolated places or with uniquely empowered people, but with all kinds of people in all kinds of circumstances. So I wanted to give a breadth. Um, and the challenge was I couldn't do a full or even an abbreviated biography of each person. So I had to pick one particular event or a highlight from their story and try to use that to demonstrate it. And then the other hard part was there were a bunch of people I left out. Um, A, because of room, and B, because I wanted explicitly to connect their activism with their faith.
Mm.
So there had to be some sort of record I could point to as a historian, whether an autobiography, a speech, testimony about this person that said it was because of their belief in God that they did these things. But what I originally started out, I worried that I would have enough material, and it turned out I had way, 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 way too much material and couldn't possibly put it all in.
Yeah. Well, what I appreciated about it is it felt a little bit like a mosaic to me, right? That's the effect I think reading the book had, is that here's a tile, right? If you only look at that little tile, it's fascinating in and of itself. But when you start to kind of back up, right, and you can kind of see the wall or see the floor
I like
take place, I
that.
think that's the way the vignettes kind of worked.
I'm gonna steal
Uh,
that analogy.
Feel free, it's kind of what I felt like. As oh, here's the other tile, and then when I step back, you can kind of see. And what I loved about it too is that and this is what when I've done my own kind of field work is discovering that it's not just people who have had all the advantages of education or money or
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
connections or standing. It's people who had nothing, right?
Precisely.
Who found a way, right? Somehow to kind of stand up and thinking about Fannie Lou Hamer, other
Mm-hmm.
folks, thinking of my Mississippi roots. But say maybe a little bit more about that. I mean, that's just the effect I had, and maybe you could just take a couple little tiles off the wall and kind of
Yes.
hold them up to us a little bit.
Absolutely. So, speaking of like different backgrounds, especially folks who came from underprivileged background, another Mississippian, Unita Blackwell, in 1976 became the first Black woman mayor of a town in Mississippi, a tiny town called Mayorsville, had dirt roads when she took over. And she was elected and did great things for this tiny town, like plumbing in homes, right? This is not that long ago. And what I love about her is, she gets activated a lot like Fannie Lou Hamer. They're really good friends. They're both in the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. She's at the 1964 Democratic National Convention and all of that. And for her activism and for her organic intellectualism and her contribution to justice, she wins a MacArthur Genius Grant, which is the same one Ta-Nehisi Coates and others have gotten. And it's just hundreds of thousands of dollars unrestricted. And she was also so human. So she, with that money, she paid for her grandson's education. She also bought herself a Cadillac, which was out of this world for somebody from her background. So I love stories like that of people who are coming from relatively little to do extraordinary things. But there's also different stories. I really liked telling the world about Charles Hamilton Houston. He trained Thurgood Marshall and was a professor at Howard Law and worked with the NAACP. And he came from a relatively privileged background. His father was a lawyer, his mother was a homemaker, excelled in school, just brilliant. And then he talked about lawyers as social engineers, meaning they should use their skills in the law not just to pad their own pockets or make a name for themselves, but to make society better, especially because he was training Black lawyers. And so he really was the architect of the strategy to attack the separate but equal clause from 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson. And the argument was simple. It was like, on its own merit, this law fails because you said, Supreme Court, that you had to provide separate but equal opportunities and facilities for Black people. Well, that was patently false and not happening. So he finds case after case after case where he wasn't arguing that it should be integrated. He was arguing in the court that it wasn't equal. And if it can't be equal, then you must share. And that's the same strategy Thurgood Marshall used in Brown v. Board in 1954. So it's just fascinating the ways, the backgrounds they came from, and then the ways that they came up to fight racism.
Yeah. No, that's great. And let me just take a quick break and like remind everybody that the Q&A is open. We're going to take about 10 more minutes for Jemar and I to talk, and then we'll open it up for questions there. So just go ahead and drop those things in the Q&A, and we'll be ready to go there. So I was going to ask about this too. One of the great gifts of writing a book is you learn stuff that you don't know when you're writing a book, and it's always one of the best excuses for writing a book is right there's
Yes.
kind of having a sense of like there's stuff here that I should know that I don't know. That's certainly the case for the last books I've written, like Hidden Roots of White Supremacy. I was clear that, like, for example, I had just gotten almost no indigenous people's history in my
Mm-hmm.
formal
Mm-hmm.
education, and so I just had little bits and pieces of things, but I didn't really understand how any of it fit together with what I did know, and like knew that was part of the journey I had to go on in that book. So this is you teach full time, so obviously a lot of this is at your fingertips already. You've got a PhD. But were there little gems that you kind of turned up with your spade as you were kind of doing the research? You were like, oh man, I didn't know that.
There was so much actually. Epic stories, really. Elizabeth Keckley was the dressmaker for Mary Todd Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's spouse. And before that, she was the dressmaker for Jeff Davis's wife before the split in the
Wow.
Confederacy. Um, but she's remarkable to me because she lived during the Civil War era and created her own business. She was born enslaved, but she was such a fabulous dressmaker that she quickly made a name for herself. She was able to raise enough money on the side to purchase her and her son's own freedom, which was an exorbitant amount that her slaveholder had set. Then she moves from, I think it was St. Louis to DC, and she starts from scratch. Matter of fact, she had to get her business in order because there was a law there that basically said if you're a Black person without, gainful employment, you have to get out of the city. And so she's scrambling, pure word of mouth, pure, skill, builds another boutique dressmaking
Mm.
business, gets essentially independently wealthy, at least independently stable. And instead of just like relaxing, she creates a foundation to help recently freed Black people and Black Union soldiers. And what is remarkable to me is that the Black community was emancipated through a war, right? It didn't just happen. And then was left penniless. You know, there's no reparations or anything. But with the very little we had, we raised support for one another, financial support, which is just mind boggling for
Mm.
people who had next to nothing to contribute that next to nothing for the uplift of others. Um, so it was, you know, random facts. Robert Small's life, stealing a Confederate ship in the dead of the night, crossing a Union blockade to freedom, becoming part of the Union Navy, piloting the same ship that he had stolen from the Confederates, and then gaining enough wealth to buy a home, the same home that his slaveholder had owned in South Carolina. Just blindingly, just blazing history, really. That I could go on and on and on. But what was sort of cemented for me is that fundamentally history is stories about people. And that actually, just a real quick anecdote, the original subtitle of The Spirit of Justice, we changed it. Not much, but significantly. So the original subtitle was Stories of Faith, Race, and Resistance. At the last minute, after we'd uploaded everything to the distributors and the merchandisers, someone on my team said it should be true stories of faith, race, and resistance, to emphasize that these are real people, ordinary people in a lot of ways. And these are their true exploits, demonstrations of courage, demonstrations of the spirit of justice to stand up against racism.
Oh, that's great. You know, so one of the things that I thought about reading this, so in Hidden Roots, I struggled a little bit with hope in that book, and I realized that like part of it was that particularly as a white Christian, I had been sort of like, you know, of course we heard about justice, but there has not been this like tradition of struggle for justice, right? And the way that there is among African American Christians and the traditions that you're, you know, putting forward. And I realized that like, you know, I think many of the reasons why I think even progressive, you know, white Christians get discouraged so quickly is because there is this expectation that like, and sometimes when you cite those texts that like, you know, justice will come down like mighty waters and righteousness will flow, right? And it sounds like it just happens, right? Like that there's just some magic that happens, right? Or it's all God, right? It's all the Spirit, and like there's no human endeavor here. And then when it doesn't just happen, I think and for me, I was kind of confess, like for me, like it just feels like immediately like hopeless, or like, you know, you kind of hit the wall and you're like, or you feel outnumbered, or you feel like the other forces of injustice or evil are bigger than you. And it's just so easy, I think, to kind of just, I don't know, kind of pull back. And so, but maybe you could just say a little bit more about the struggle piece of it.
Yeah, I appreciate how you put that. You know, that I sense it too, that in many ways white Christians haven't built up the calluses, the spiritual calluses that come from working for justice. You know, when you work out or you're you know doing physically exerting work, your hands they get blistered and bloody at first, but then calluses develop and you get tougher. I feel like Black folks in general dealing with racism, and Black Christians in particular, have developed these spiritual calluses in a good way, not to make us unfeeling, but to make us more resilient, right? And so in this book, that's part of what I'm trying to convey, are those spiritual calluses come from centuries of resistance, of two steps forward, one step back, right? Of a not a linear path of progress,
Yeah.
but a winding path of progress. And I think even for Black folks, we need to be reminded of this great cloud of historical witnesses whose legacies we inherit to empower us. But I think also for white folks, need to be exposed to branches of the church different than right-wing Christianity or white evangelical Christianity that have a different testimony, one of struggle, particularly against racism, and not losing faith in God, and not giving up, because to me, hope is less of a feeling and more of an action. Any action you take to resist injustice is an act of hope and a demonstration of hope. So, what does it look like to learn from those people who really, under even more adverse circumstances than we're facing now, uh, found a way to demonstrate hope through action?
Great, thanks for that. Yeah, so I'm going to turn now to some questions. All right, so I'm gonna go. It looks like there's some in the chat and some in the Q&A. If you could put them in the Q&A, that'll help me keep up with it. But I'll pull the ones from the chat here too. So here's one. Facing from Deborah, facing the upcoming presidential election, what do you think is the threat of Christian nationalism, the Christian faith, justice for all, and democracy? And there's a small question to kick off the Q&A
Yeah.
for you.
Well, it's just funny that I'm on with you because I think we could both talk in depth about that. Um, I'll focus on, okay, so to democracy, Christian nationalism, white Christian nationalism is fundamentally authoritarian because it wants to narrow the scope of who counts as a citizen, who counts as a voter. You know, on some of the extremes, they're even talking about, should women be able to vote still, right? Because the man is the head of the household and his vote should, be the household vote. I mean, you get into some wacky stuff here, but it's all related to this hierarchy, this authoritarian hierarchy that they want to establish. So democratic participation is under threat, not to mention the peaceful transfer of power. Let's say Kamala Harris, builds on this momentum to a win in the electoral college and the popular vote. We have no guarantee that the other side will accept those results. And Robbie, you have the stats on this. That side is more prone to say violence may be necessary to bring about desired political ends. So that's the threat to democracy in a nutshell, in addition to the many other things we could list in Project 2025, like doing away with the Department of Education, right? But I want to say there's also a threat to the witness of the church today. And that language is advised. So I say the witness of the church, not the church itself, because Jesus said the gates of hell will not prevail against the church. But the witness of the church, that is the testimony or the reputation or the credibility of the church, is at stake with white Christian nationalism because people see the bigotry, the hatred, the exclusion, the vitriol, and they say, well, if that's what Christianity is, I want nothing to do with it. And who could blame them? But if there are Christians who say, well, that's not the way of Jesus, then we have to rise up and resist white Christian nationalism because we claim the same faith and we claim the same savior, but we have to demonstrate a different witness.
Great. All right, here's one from Steve. Part of my ongoing struggle is to try to serve God first and nations second, but too often find myself being convicted by Jesus' words about not serving two masters. How can we be good Americans while being followers of Jesus?
So I think what being a quote unquote good American means is to love your neighbor and to pursue justice. So I'm giving a presentation to a group of executives soon. And I was really intimidated because I'm talking about race, religion, and politics, all the controversy you
Right.
can court. Um, and I don't really want to make it a right versus left thing, a Democratic versus Republican thing, because this is going to be a mixed crowd politically. What I want to say is politics is about power. And what's the purpose of power in the political realm? Is to pursue justice. It's for the common good, if you want to put it that way. And so to this question, I don't think there's a contradiction between being a conscientious citizen and a citizen of the kingdom of God. I do think that sometimes there are conflicts on certain policies, on certain positions and laws, right? So that's where Christians should be the conscience in the political system as a whole, and certainly to their party. See, my goal is not to make everyone a Democrat or everyone a whatever. My goal is that we would be faithful Christians in whatever party we choose. And that is going to cause us to contradict or go against certain stances in that chosen party. And I think that's the way it should work. What's happened, at least since the rise of the religious right in the late 1970s, is there's been this one-to-one equation of Christian and Republican. We have to decouple that. And honestly, I think we have to turn down the volume on what we think our votes indicate. Because right now we have a lot of people saying the way you vote indicates your eternal salvation and whether you are or aren't a Christian. I think that's problematic. To complicate matters, though, I think the stakes are higher. Will we have a democratic process? Will we, do mass deportations, which will ultimately, result in violence? I think the moral stakes are starker and starker as we go, and so that puts Christians in a more difficult. I think that constrains the political options for many Christians.
Great. All right, here's one from Kate. It may seem obvious, but why publishing now? Specific through lines to this election, question mark, and best ways to spread the spirit of this work now in this fraught environment.
So the why now question. I really think that we as a citizenry and as people of faith need to be prepared for hardship in a lot of ways. Certainly political hardship of I just keep emphasizing no matter who wins the election, that's only the beginning. Like that's the end of one stage and the beginning of another, and we don't know what's coming. I mean, it could be more political violence, it could be, disrupted economies, it could be war, it could be a lot of different things. And so I'm really concerned about resilience in this season. You could call it hope, that we don't quit working for justice even when we face setbacks. So I think that's a big of the why now reason. The through lines to this election, there's so much pessimism here, there's so much cynicism here, there's so much of, well, both sides are bad, what is a Christian to do? And I just, to be frank, cynicism is a luxury of the privileged. People who are oppressed don't have the option to be apathetic because they're dealing with existential issues that affect their everyday lives. And I want to communicate and convey that and show that. And I thought, at least for me, I think partly the book is what I needed, was rather than sort of a didactic argument with point A, B, C, that point about resilience and hope could more effectively be conveyed through real life, true stories, where we learn lessons from people's lived theology, not a systematic theology, if you will.
Great. Thanks, Jemar. All right, here's one from Richard. Jews have been infused with the spirit of justice for over 2,000 years and worked on behalf of Black justice for much of the 20th century and into the 21st century. Do you mention that support? And I'll add, maybe to also talk about the connections between that tradition and the African American Christian tradition, and maybe ways that are different than the white Christian tradition. That's just my own little riff on that as well.
I mean, look, just to be honest, this topic is fraught when we're bringing up Jewish people, anti-Semitism because of what's happening in Gaza. So I don't know what's behind that question. I'll answer it, but I answer it as a historian and as a Black man with lived experience in this country. So oppressed people can recognize oppression, and I think that's what led to a lot of the Jewish and Black solidarity, particularly during the civil rights movement. Uh, Jewish people globally have had a fresh memory of what happened in World War II and a much longer history before that, of course. And so that was a wonderful demonstration of, interreligious, interracial solidarity. I think there are differences. I think Jewish people can be white passing phenotypically, meaning looking at someone, right? You might pass as white. And you can buy into that identity. I don't know if that's controversial to some, but it's just a reality, right? I can't pass as white no matter how I talk, no matter how I dress, whatever. So that's a difference in the reality is when it comes to racism, and there's a particular history of racism in this country linked back to race-based chattel slavery. Uh, that is something that is always affecting Black people. And we always are needing to address it. And that's not even necessarily a cause for difference or contention. That's just a reality. So it's a broad spectrum. I think Black folks are grateful for any solidarity we can get with any kind of people and are constantly working toward that. And I think there's some great examples historically. Do I address it in the book? No, I address mainly Black Christians and the Christian religion in the book. There are other works, I'm sure, that delve into that more specifically.
Great. All right. Well, here's one from David. Living in Mississippi, the injustice and tendency for violence by MAGA folks is palpable. I'd like to ask them, what is the nature of your God? Do you embrace a violent God, violence and revelation? Do you believe in an all-loving, kind, inclusive God, a God of justice, loving thy neighbors thyself? Whichever God you worship is how you will live your life. What do you think?
I mean, my first thought is they're going to embrace the God of Fox News and OANN and, whatever media bubble that they're in is probably more indicative of the kind of religion they practice than the Bible they read. That's a that's a bar, as the kids would say. That's a good line. It just is, right? Like pastors right now are wringing their hands because they are dealing with congregation members who are more informed by the talking heads on the right wing than voices from scripture or the church, historically or present day. So I think a lot of that answer has to do with the discourse and the dialogue that people are involved in. And how you pierce that bubble is the question of the age. As we live in the information age, how do you get people out of not only out of like closed information systems, but ones that increasingly aren't even dealing with basic facts? Right? Like there's a consensus in the scientific community that climate change is real and humans are having a big impact on that. But when you've got, almost 24/7 coverage of people who deny that, now we're in a whole different realm of contention, right? Because it's not just getting a different variety of sources of information. It's you're living in a different galaxy as far as facts. and how do you bring folks back, it's an epistemological question. How do we know what we know? How do we know what's true? And there are increasingly people who are questioning the basic agreed upon realities that even Republicans and Democrats in ages past have had consensus on. So that's the real challenge.
Well, I'll put in a plug for your field here. I'm a sociologist, you're a historian, but I think history plays a huge role, right? And again, it's a question of kind of breaking through, but telling truer histories about ourselves, like to help us understand how we got here. Like those are things that kind of help ground us. And again, kind of hard to break through sometimes, but I think it's important. And I think like this book kind of holding up these stories, right? And kind of reminding us, oh, like all like the Democratic Party not being an all white Southern party, right? That didn't just happen, right? There were people who pushed and stood up and risked their lives, right, to make that happen. And kind of remembering all that. So I think we've kind of come to the end of the questions. We're close to the end of time, but I like to ask authors if they want to read something. So maybe you could read us something here, give us a little flavor of the book. And we could sort of take ourselves out with some words off the page from you and in your own voice.
So, yeah, and by the way, if you get the audible or the audio version of the book, it's me reading, so
Hey,
you'll
good
hear
for
a
you.
familiar voice. Um, so we've been talking about hope, and I try to end the book on a note of hope. So I just want to read the last paragraph from the last chapter, which is called The Spirit of Justice Speaks. It goes like this: the same spirit of justice that empowered generations past is available to you today. It's been there for people across time whenever they needed it. It's here when you need it too. And lamentably, it's always needed. So pause for a moment. Listen intently to the sound of your soul and the echoes of your ancestors. Listen closely enough, and you will hear a still, small voice encouraging you to declare your dignity and stand up for righteousness. The spirit of justice still speaks.
Oh, that's beautiful. Thanks, Jemar. That's a really great way to round us out. All right. So it is Jemar Tisby, The Spirit of Justice, True Stories of Faith, Race, and Resistance. It is out just this week. As I'll just kind of, as a fellow author, say, it is really important. If you're going to buy the book, buy it this week. It really helps the book kind of get out of the gate. Publishers pay attention to what the first week of sales are, and in our algorithm world determines all kinds of things. If you're going to buy it, I'll just kind of give a little nudge to kind of buy it this week, help it out of the gate. But thank you so much for writing the book, Jemar, for this beautiful mosaic you've given us of the spirit of justice, and for giving it to us at this really crucial time in our nation's history.
Well, thank you for having me on the show. I appreciate folks tuning in. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, everybody. More to come.